Welcome to Fantastic Facts. Today we bring you the story of
Fall of Rangoon.
Rangoon, the then capital of Southeast Asian country Burma, presently known as Myanmar, was occupied by British Indian forces under the expansionist zeal of British Empire after three successive wars starting from 1824 and finally resulting into inclusion of Burma in British India in 1885. After World War I, a modern nationalist movement both in India and Burma forced British Raj to separate it from British India in 1935 in a hope of weakening the Burmese struggle for independence. Meanwhile, in 1942 World War II broke out and Japanese imperial forces attacked the Southeast Asian colonies of British Empire under the slogan of Asia for Asian. With this came the news of Allied reverses from all over Southeast Asia. The British had evacuated the white residents and generally left the subject people to their fate, results into anger and protest all over British India. During all this, the Burma campaign starts primarily between the forces of the British Empire and China, with support from the United States, against the invading forces of the Empire of Japan, Thailand, and the Indian National Army, constituted of prisoners of war of British Indian Army under Mohan S. Ing, an Indian officer of the British Indian Army in Malaya, and later under Subhash Chandra Bose. The climate of the region is dominated by the seasonal monsoon rains, which allowed effective campaigning for only just over half of each year. This, together with other factors such as famine and disorder in British India and the priority given by the Allies to the defeat of Nazi Germany, prolonged the campaign and divided it into four phases. Phase 1, the Japanese invasion, which led to the expulsion of British, Indian and Chinese forces in 1942. Phase 2, failed attempts by the Allies to mount offensives into Burma, from late 1942 to early 1944. Phase 3, the 1944 Japanese invasion of India, which ultimately failed following the battles of Impel and Kohima. And finally Phase 4, the successful Allied offensive, which reoccupied Burma from late 1944 to mid-1945. Japanese conquest of Burma. Japanese objectives in Burma were initially limited to the capture of Rangoon, now known as Yangon, the capital and principal seaport. This would close the overland supply line to China and provide a strategic bulwark to defend Japanese gains in British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese 15th Army swiftly captured the South Burma through North Thailand. With the effective collapse of the entire defensive line, there was little choice left other than an overland retreat to India for British Indian Army and to Yunnan for the Chinese 200th Division in eastern part of T. He Front. During the Battle of Yunnan-Burma Road, Japanese advanced to the Indian frontier. After the fall of Rangoon in March 1942, the Allies attempted to make a stand in the north of the country, Upper Burma, having been reinforced by a Chinese expeditionary force. The Allies were also faced with growing numbers of Burmese insurgents, and the civil administration broke down in the areas they still held. Meanwhile, heavy Japanese reinforcement after capture of Singapore, collapse of newly formed Burma Corps, and with their forces cut off from almost all sources of supply, the Allied commanders finally decided to evacuate their forces from Burma. Under great odds, Burma Corps managed to make it most of the way to Imphal, in Manipur in India, just before the monsoon broke in May 1942, having lost most of their equipment and transport. There, they found themselves living out in the open under torrential rains in extremely unhealthy circumstances. The army and civil authorities in India were very slow to respond to the needs of the troops and civilian refugees. This brings the war at the Indo-Burma border. The Allied build-up was also hampered by the disordered state of eastern India at the time. There were violent Quit India protests in Bengal and Bihar, which required large numbers of British troops to suppress. There was also a disastrous famine in Bengal, which may have led to 3 million deaths through starvation, disease, and exposure. The balance shifts of 1943 to 1944. From December 1943 to November 1944, the strategic balance of the Burma campaign shifted decisively. Improvements in Allied leadership, training, and logistics, together with greater firepower and growing Allied air superiority. In August 1943, the Allies created Southeast Asia Command, under Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. Meanwhile, Subhash Chandra Bose, commander of the Indian National Army, emphasized the advantages which would be gained by a successful attack into India. With misgivings on the part of several Japanese officers, Operation Yugo was launched. Part of the Yugo plan included soldiers of the Indian National Army joining the Japanese and fighting alongside Imperial Army troops as they entered India, with the idea being for Japan to be viewed by the Indian people more as a liberation force rather than an invasion force. The Indian National Army, whose only reason for existence was to remove the yoke of their British overlords, had been convinced by Japan that by combining forces they could in fact overthrow British and European rule, just as the Japanese had up to that point all over Asia. The Japanese invasion of India 1944. The British were led by Lieutenant General William Slim, a brilliant tactician who reformed and retrained the Eastern Army after its crushing defeat in Burma. The British and Indian forces were supported by planes commanded by the United States Army Gen. Joseph Stilwell. Once the Allies became certain that the Japanese planned to attack, General Slim withdrew his forces from western Burma and had them dig defensive positions in the hills around Imphal Valley, hoping to draw the Japanese into a battle far from their supply lines. But none of the British commanders believed that the Japanese could cross the nearly impenetrable jungles around Kohima in force, so when a full division of nearly 15,000 Japanese troops came swarming out of the vegetation on April 4, the town was only lightly defended by some 1,500 British and Indian troops. The Japanese encirclement meant that those troops were largely cut off from reinforcements and supplies, and a bitter battle eventually led the British and Indians to withdraw into a small enclosure next to a tennis court. The Japanese, without air support or supplies, eventually became exhausted, and the Allied forces soon pushed them out of Kohima and the hills around Imphal. On June 22, British and Indian forces finally cleared the last of the Japanese from the crucial road linking Imphal and Kohima, ending the siege. The Japanese 15th Army, 85,000 strong for the invasion of India, was essentially destroyed, with 53,000 dead and missing. Injuries and illnesses took many of the rest. There were 16,500 British casualties. The Battle of Kohima and Imphal was the bloodiest of World War II in India, and it cost Japan much of its best army in Burma. But the battle has been largely forgotten in India as an emblem of the country's colonial past. The Indian troops who fought and died here were subjects of the British Empire. In this remote, northeastern corner of India, more recent battles with a mix of local insurgencies among tribal groups that have long sought autonomy have made remembrances of former glories a luxury. The Japanese regard the Battle of Imphal to be their greatest defeat ever, and it gave Indian soldiers a belief in their own martial ability and showed that they could fight as well or better than anyone else. The Allied reoccupation of Burma 1944–1945. The Allies launched a series of offensive operations into Burma during late 1944 and the first half of 1945. From all front Northwest-South Allies starts reoccupation of Burma with more emphasis on air power, while Japanese forces with low morale and lack of supply caused by Allies' air attacks in Pacific eventually forced them to retreat. Race for Rangoon. Though the Allied force had advanced successfully into central Burma, it was vital to capture the port of Rangoon before the monsoon to avoid a logistics crisis. The Japanese occupation caused hardship for people and ill treatment by Japanese force resulted in a national uprising within Burma and the defection of the entire Burma National Army to the Allied side. In addition to the Allied advance, the Japanese now faced open rebellion behind their lines. With reversal for Japanese forces all over Southeast Asia in 1945, British Indian forces eventually recaptured the Rangoon result of Burma campaign. The military and political results of the Burma campaign have been contentious on the Allied side. In military terms, the Japanese retained control of Burma until the result of the campaign was irrelevant to the fate of Japan. It was recognized by many contemporary U.S. authorities and later American historians that the campaign was a sideshow and, apart from distracting some Japanese land forces from China or the Pacific, did not contribute to the defeat of Japan, although the recovery of Burma was reckoned a triumph for the British Indian Army. After the war ended, a combination of the pre-war agitation among the Burma population for independence and the economic ruin of Burma during the 4 years campaign made it impossible for the former regime to be resumed. Within 3 years, both Burma and India were independent. Against these criticisms, the attempted Japanese invasion of India in 1944 was launched on unrealistic premises and resulted in the greatest defeat the Japanese armies had suffered to that date. After the Singapore debacle and the loss of Burma in 1942, the British were bound to defend India at all costs, as a successful invasion by Japanese imperial forces would have been disastrous. The defense operations at Kohima and Impel in 1944 have since taken on huge symbolic value as the turning of the tide in British fortunes in the war in the East. The American historian Raymond Callahan concluded Slim's great victory helped the British, unlike the French, Dutch, or later the Americans, to leave Asia with some dignity. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe our channel for more such videos.